thank you everyone for joining today. As most of you probably know, the purpose that brings all of us together across Teach for All is to develop collective leadership to ensure all children fulfill their potential. And the context for our effort is that all over the world, we're failing to ensure that all of our children have the kind of education and support and opportunity that will set them up to be able to shape a better future for all of us. And in fact, we've learned over recent years just how far we are from enabling that kind of an education. In fact, we're in quite a significant kind of global learning crisis. First, we saw a couple of years ago in the RISE research, which was a 10-year massive educational research project out of the Blavatnik School at Oxford that looked at all the low and low to middle income countries in the world, 50 years of data to understand really what's happening in terms of our education systems. And that research showed us that, in fact, in many countries, in most countries, educational outcomes have actually gone down over the last 4 decades. And then just recently, we saw in the latest PISA results, as you know, the international assessment that enables countries in high and middle income countries to benchmark themselves based on the problem solving and critical thinking skills and actually measures of student well-being among 15-year-olds. That report showed that we're in the midst of a 10-year decline in academic outcomes. And so it's not even just a COVID effect, right? Like this decline started before COVID. So you consider all that, and we should be realizing, right, like we need to do a major reset because it's not for lack of trying, okay? I mean, we all know, like there's so many governments, multilateral institutions, philanthropists, practitioners, and of course, educators throwing so much at this crisis, and yet outcomes aren't reflecting all that effort. So clearly we need to be doing things differently. The RISE research began to give us a clue about what needs to change. And its kind of main headline, I would say, is that most educational effort goes into what they call a set of kind of technical solutions that are very important and, in fact, crucial to progress, but not sufficient. And those technical practices are all about kind of aligning the system, being clear about your standards, lining up curriculum, assessments, teacher training, and all the other things of education. Like we need to make sure the schools are open, et cetera. But what they found is that, there are many places that do those things where outcomes aren't improving. Okay, so what's the X factor? And their conclusion was that the X factor is a shared sense of purpose felt throughout an ecosystem, throughout the ecosystem around kids, a shared sense of purpose towards the purpose of students learning. And they look at, in a number of school systems, all the different purposes that different actors might have. It's not always towards the purpose of students learning. I mean, in some cases, maybe it's educating the elites or employing the adults, but what they found was that where there's a shared sense of purpose and everyone's on the same mission towards ensuring that all children learn and develop and thrive, then all those technical practices are done with intention. But the research leaves us with an open question, which is how do you develop that shared sense of purpose? And as we think about our work across Teach for All, what we've seen, I think, is that this effort to develop collective leadership is one way. And so the context for this report is years of learning that the Global Learning Lab of Teach for All has been leading, engaging practitioners in communities all over the world, across our network, as well as allies beyond our network, in these questions of, what is collective leadership? How do we develop it? And how does that collective leadership relate to system change? So this is our first kind of official report surfacing the insights that have come from all of this kind of practitioner-driven learning And you'll see from the report that it also includes 9 case studies written by researchers from different countries across our network. So we're very excited to share the insights that have emerged from this work and to engage in a broader discussion. And so with that, I will hand it over to Alex, who has been leading this work at our Global Learning Lab and can share much more.
A tiny bit on background, as Wendy was saying, the report that we're bringing out today, with the support of many people around our network, is built on 15 years of our learning as a Teach for All global network. It's built on 5 years of work by our Global Learning Lab that's involved more than 600 leaders in our network. It's involved dozens of learning experiences that we've hosted with and for network partners, and many engagements with our friends across the global ecosystem, from whom we've learned a lot and with whom we've collaborated on things. And just to reiterate, the conclusion that we have come to broadly, this is the starting point for this report, is that systemic change in education is really going to be the result of an interplay between 2 key pillars. On the one hand, as Wendy said, quality technical solutions, well implemented, good policies, good approaches to things like curriculum, teacher training, and so on. But if you only focus on that, the evidence suggests we don't bring about change that we want to see. And so our understanding is that we need to make a parallel investment in the development of collective leadership. And through these 2 things together, will bring about systemic change. And so the purpose of this report that we've engaged in over the last 18 months is to formalize our learning around that. What is it that we mean by collective leadership? How do we develop it within our network? And in what ways do we see it contributing to shifts at the system level? So as Wendy said, in order to develop the report, we built on that background knowledge and developed 9 new case studies with network partners. We also took as a starting point a piece of research done by the People First community, of which Teach for All is a member. Now, the People First community looks at development in general and not education in particular. And working with a group of researchers around the world that included leading global experts on leadership, that piece of research came up with an initial definition of collective leadership. Now, this is collective leadership in any field, whether it might be in business or the social sector. But the definition they came up with we use as a starting point. And that is that collective leadership is a group of people making meaning together to find direction, to coordinate their interdependent actions, to achieve a socially useful outcome that each one of them would not have been able to produce on their own. And the idea here is that leadership is not something that is about someone's position or about an individual. Rather, it's a shared type of work that members of a collective agree to do together. And we use this as the starting point for our own research. We like this way of thinking about collective leadership that had been identified in this evidence review, which looked right across the development world to see how leadership was contributing to development. So that was our starting point. What did we learn about the collective leadership that transforms education, how we develop it, and how it shifts systems? What do we mean by collective leadership? So in this research, when we looked across our Teach for All global network, we found that there were sort of 4 key characteristics of the collective leadership that seemed to be contributing to change at the community, system, neighborhood, regional level. First of all, there were people at all levels of the ecosystem exercising leadership and agency, not just those in positions of formal authority or power, not just those inside the education system, but people in different sectors with different backgrounds, different roles. It was really important that that leadership was coming from right throughout the ecosystem around students. Secondly, that the people that were exercising that leadership were locally rooted and diverse, so inclusive both of those who represent communities that are experiencing injustice in education, but also including those with more historic privilege or power who maybe have access to authority in the short term. Thirdly, that these groups of people were committed to the shared purpose, typically in our network, of developing all students as leaders or of tackling injustice or tackling educational inequity. And finally, that these leaders had relationships and networks that existed between them, high levels of trust that enabled them to collaborate together, to learn together, to come up with shared plans and make shared progress. And just, by way of an example, if you think about the past decade of improvements in education in Delhi, in India, you can see some of these things playing out. So there, in the past decade, learning outcomes have improved slightly for students, and the system has become oriented to an idea of entrepreneurship for its young people. Now, partly that was to do with new policies by a new government, increased spending on education, the implementation of specific programs, like reading at the right level. But at the same time, there is this thriving, over that same period, a thriving ecosystem of civil society organizations came together to support that work. Things like Dream a Dream, Indus Action, Teach for India, of course, Pratam. And there was a big effort made to more closely involve parents, school management committees, and students as agents of change within that work. So what might look like on the surface a sort of story of top-down educational success is actually, I think, a story of collective leadership, of people coming together to make change throughout the ecosystem. And of course, we saw some Teach for India alumni playing roles within that as a community. So if that's what we see as collective leadership, how do we develop it? So here we saw just 4 key strategies that organizations use or can use to develop this collective leadership. They're pretty simple. First of all, recruiting people into the collective. So building a critical mass of people that are working towards this thing together in a particular context. Now, within our network, that often involves the core 2-year program, but it can also involve bringing students, parents, school leaders, teachers, and others into a shared effort. Development, building the capacity of people to lead in this way, to work together, to have the mindsets that enable them to do that. Again, that happens in a 2-year program that all of our network partners run, but it also works in the way they support their alumni, the way those alumni themselves might build the capacity of others in the system. Thirdly, connection. We think it matters that there are purposeful efforts made to knit together relationships between people, build networks, grow trust. And that's really important for sharing power, finding new ways of working. And fourth, the final action we identified was this one of convening, the act of bringing people together to make plans for shared action, to act together, to learn together what's working and what's not, to adjust course together, and so on. And this is sometimes known by other terms like process facilitation or orchestration, but it's the idea of that bringing people together to make change. An example of this from our network we saw in Ancash in the Peruvian Andes. There, Teach for Peru have been working, Enseña Peru, I should say, have been working for about the past 8 years. And they started with that region with a specific model in mind, that they were going to have a kind of collective approach to bringing about change. So in Ancash, 8 years ago, they got together with the local Ministry of Education and a local funder to establish a long-term commitment to that region. It has about 7,000 students, about 20,000 inhabitants in total. They then spent time recruiting fellows to the region. So they placed about 100 fellows over those 8 years in the region, retaining many of them there. They did lots to develop the leadership of those fellows, but they also began to develop the capacities of other people in the system, existing teachers. They had some parent programs, some programs for school leaders, and they did a lot of work to connect people. So they ran these annual events called INE, in which they bring together about 1,000 community members from all levels of the ecosystem. So you'd have a local ministry official, parents, students, teachers, all gathering together over the course of 3 days in rooms to reflect on the progress they were making as a region. And that was done through deep relationship building. I think about Jose Antonio, who led much of that work, and he just talked about being a part of the community, really getting to know people, building trust over time. And then in terms of convening, like through this INE process, but also through some coalitions that they built with the ministry and their funder, they developed these shared action plans each year, shared approaches to measurement, shared approaches to coming together to reflect on how things were going. So sort of they embodied all of these different characteristics. And the data shows from an independent evaluation that there are signs of improvement, not just for the students in NCN-approved classrooms, but signs of improvement in learning for students across the system. Of course, it's very early days, but we saw these kind of 4 characteristics at play. And then finally, if that's how collective leadership is developed, what's our theory for how it might influence change at the system level? So I think to start here, I just want to say our understanding of education systems is they're not like mechanical systems that respond to simple inputs where you can pull a policy lever and generate a guaranteed outcome in learning in the classroom. They're complex systems. Education systems are fundamentally human systems. They're made up in most countries of millions, if not tens of millions of people. And for that reason, they are influenced by people's habits, mindsets, capacities, biases, connections every day. And so we think it's better to understand them as these complex systems, complex natural systems. And there, we, like many others in global education, like the RISE program, Brookings Center for Education, and others, have therefore embraced the work of a systems theorist, Donella Meadows, who theorizes how you can achieve change in these kinds of complex systems. And she says that we should think about changing these kinds of systems according to leverage points, finding the places in a system where a change in one place can result in multiple changes elsewhere. And she says that actually in these systems, lots of the things that we typically think of when it comes to system change, like new policies, more resources, changes in infrastructure, are actually relatively easy to do, but have a lower effect, a lesser effect on what the system is actually doing. And she says, actually, just like the RISE research that Wendy mentioned, if you can affect shifts in the top right-hand corner of this diagram, shifts in purpose, shifts in the mindsets of people in the system, shifts in the goals of the system, shifts in trust or agency or how people collaborate, then you can achieve bigger systemic change. The trick is that it's harder to achieve changes in those dimensions of the system. But one of the things that we're quite excited about in thinking about this people side of change and the development of collective leadership is that we feel that collective leadership, if it can be grown to a sufficient critical mass, can have an effect on things like shifting purpose or shifting power in systems. And by way of an example, Teach for Armenia, which has been operating in Armenia now for about 15 years, has built a really thriving network of alumni who are working in education, in the ministry, in the private sector, including a few people in key influential positions. They, in that time, have managed to affect a shift in the stated purpose of education in Armenia. The Armenian education system now recognizes the importance of focusing on what they call achieving an education equilibrium. So in other words, taking seriously the fact that some people in the system, particularly poorer kids in rural areas, haven't historically had the same opportunities, but that's now their stated aim, is to give those same groups similar opportunities. And we think that's an exciting first step in then policies, resources, learning, capacities flowing in that direction. So that's my introduction to what collective leadership is in our understanding, how we can think about growing it, and where it might influence the system.
Today, we are blessed to have 2 phenomenal leaders on the Teach for All network here with us, who will share their experiences in building collective leadership in their own context. Please welcome Tomas Reka, CEO, Esenya Chile, and Folawe Omikunle, CEO, Teach for Nigeria. Welcome. Folawe, I would love to begin with you. And first, it's really lovely to have you here. During the past 7 years of Teach for Nigeria's work, what are some of the strategic choices the team has made to transform the wider education system around children in the country?
Before I answer your question, I think it's just important to maybe share my experience a bit about how I've experienced the education system since working in this sector. And one thing that I've known is that Nigeria has, our education system has faced significant challenges for as long as I remember. And when I reflect on the outcome of this, like we can see this around poor learning outcomes, low enrollment rates, the overall output of graduates and youth across the country where, they're unemployable and also unemployed. And so, but it's also important to note that for as long as I've been here, I've also recognized that there's been a lot of investment. So there's been interventions, there's been investment in increasing school enrollment, improving teacher training, in recruiting more teachers, in introducing new policies, in creating new agencies. And all of those things have happened. But because education system operates within such a complex ecosystem, it involves multiple stakeholders who must work together to achieve the outcomes that we want. And in fact, at Teach for Nigeria, what we say is that we see the ecosystem as a jigsaw puzzle with different pieces controlled by both internal players who are directly working within the education system, but also external players from everywhere beyond the education ecosystem. And so all of whom they have to work together for us to really have meaningful change. So for this to happen, we believe at Teach for Nigeria that we need a critical mass of diverse people who are all working together across different levels and towards achieving the same goal. So our strategic choices are really embedded and rooted in that understanding. So first, we start with prioritizing how we're attracting and how we're recruiting diverse talents into our program. We prioritize bringing in resilient, entrepreneurial, promising graduates and professionals, and they come from diverse backgrounds. And we also recognize the potential of existing teachers as we're building this movement and bringing all these individuals on board. Because one of the things that we say is that this is not an exclusive club reserved for some special folks, but rather it's a call to our most promising citizens and leaders to join a movement for change. So from the point of recruitment to completion, our messaging is underscored to really come into like a higher purpose for leadership. And then we go ahead to provide really intensive training and support, and which starts with a pre-service training, really equipping our participants with the skills, the mindset, also first enabling them to foster key relationships that allow them to succeed and really develop their leadership. I must mention that our leadership program is focused on 3 key pillars. First, it's leading self, leading learning, and then leading systems. And so the idea really is that there's a progression from first leading yourself and then to the systemic leadership over a 2-year period that's in our core fellowship program, and also same even in our additional programs, which I'll get to. And so to enable these transitions, what we have in our program is that in the 2nd year of the fellowship program, of our core program, fellows have to implement something we call the Be the Change project. It's a social impact project that allows them to identify challenges creating barriers to accessing quality education. And then thereafter, we invest in the leadership of others within the education ecosystem to further catalyze our impact. So through initiatives like our school leadership development program, our existing teacher training program, we mobilize school leaders, existing systems teachers to equally unleash their leadership within the ecosystem. Now, within all of these programs, we incorporate, this piece around the Be the Change project, the social impact project, to ensure that everybody is thinking solution to like the different issues. Everybody is thinking about pieces to the jigsaw puzzle that they can commit themselves to solve it. On top of this, we have something that we call the incubation program, which is further created to help incubate ideas, the innovations that are emerging from our alumni beyond the 2-year fellowship program. And then finally, we convene spaces, we hold spaces through our conferences, through town hall meetings, through government engagement, through speaker series, to reconnect, realign individuals and all these diverse stakeholders towards our vision. In fact, I must share that one of the things that we've been able to achieve is to align the calendar of our pre-service training program alongside the school leadership kickoff program to ensure that we're bringing together the school leaders and the fellows in the first week of the pre-service so that they're fostering and building key relationships. I'll pause here, but these are some of the strategic choices that we have made to cultivate the network of leaders that are transforming education in Nigeria. Thank you.
What have you witnessed to be the impact of building this critical mass of leaders across the system? What have you witnessed to be the outcome at the community level and also at the systems level?
A lot, I've witnessed a lot personally, but I'd say that one of the biggest shifts that we've observed and that also has been documented is just a mindset change amongst our fellows, amongst our participants and our alumni altogether. I would share that 70% of our alumni today, and we've had over 800 plus alumni in our program, have remained in education or, indirectly in education as a result of the experience of the fellowship. We have school heads who are switching up their school culture as a result of the experience that they've had. An example is a school leader participant who abolished the use of corporal punishment and also then introduced a positive way to reinforce positive behavior in the school. And we've seen how this has just given these children and students a sense of belonging, but we've also seen how this culture has cascaded even to existing teachers within that school. This is something that our fellow alone or an alumni alone wouldn't have been able to achieve, but it required the partnership of a school leader, imbibing that mindset and really leading on this. Another thing that we've seen is non-education professionals who are now working collaboratively with schools and with school leaders. An example that I shared very recently has to be a bordering community towards the Republic of Benin, where in this community, students were not attending school. So they weren't going to school, they were missing out on school because they were engaging in smuggling practices, across the border. That was something that over the years, these schools had been trying to just figure out how to ensure that students were staying in school. This required the cooperation and collaboration of the custom officials, the border officials, the immigration officials to actually come together and work with school leaders, with parents, with children. And we saw that happening recently, where in the history of that community, these folks all came together and decided they were going to work to ensure kids were staying back in school. The improvement we've seen in enrollment and retention as a result of that has been incredible. Another thing that we have seen, and I'll share just this last one, is even our alumni are running programs that are addressing problems within and from externally affecting the education ecosystem. For example, Aramide Oluwaseun is running Talent Mine Academy. She's providing free education, tuition-free education for out-of-school children. School Linker is training thousands of teachers, and that's Coyote, and this was all sort of birthed after the experiencing and after going through the 2-year fellowship. And so those are some of the impacts that we have seen directly. There's so many more impacts and just stories, but that's sort of how we've seen this play out locally and in our communities.
Thomas, it's great to see you again. I know we were just on a call last week where you were discussing the state of education in Chile. I would love for you to briefly share the issues surrounding education in Chile and also what Enseña Chile is doing to challenge the logic of the current system to redefine its purpose.
My first takeaway after reading the missing piece article is that this is not a new idea, right? It's not a sophisticated idea. It's a very, I would say, antique idea that we've seen in many cases in the history of humanity, not only in education. For example, in my country, in Chile, there are many earthquakes, right? And when earthquakes come in, it's a big mess. But you see the power of people getting together with a shared purpose. And we managed to earthquake after earthquake, be able to overcome and have success as a community, as a society, as a nation as well. And if you see that in the history of humanity with, why not? You can see it right now with global climate change, right? We saw it in the last couple of years with the COVID-19. And we've seen it so many times with wars, unfortunately, that we have to get together in order to have, let's say, to overcome this so difficult situations. And the only thing I would like to underline is that education won't be an exception. It is, let's say, an earthquake. It is a pandemic. It is like a famine where we're losing so much of our most precious resource as a nation, which is its people, right? So it's not a new thing. It's a very antique idea, and we've seen it work so many times in many situations. Education won't be an exception, right? So that's the first thing. Unfortunately, in Chile, going back to your question, Henry, we've put too much effort and time in the technical part only. I think policy is very important. I studied in a school of government. I love policies. I think they're great. But I've seen the missing piece in Chile. We've put so much effort in only in public policy, only in resources, only in the technical part. And if you see the last 10, 15 years of our nation, we've basically passed in 2009, from 2000 to 2009, we were the country that most increased or decreased the achievement gap. We were the country that had the biggest, let's say, increase in quality and in equity in education, according to PISA tests. But since then, we've decreased in learning, we've decreased in student enrollment. And because all of our effort has gone only into the policy part. So going to what we are doing as a program, I would say that the most effective thing I've seen in 15 years of Enseña Chile is a little bit what Wendy said in the beginning of the call, right, of this space, which is when we focus on a shared purpose, it's so much easier to get people together. It's very easy when, for example, Chile had to recuperate its democracy. The shared purpose was so clear, right? When we have our earthquake, the shared purpose is so clear. But when it's education, it's not that clear, it's not that easy. So when we lift that up, when we put that over the table and say, guys, this is justice in our country. This is, the achievement gap in our country. This is the future of democracy in our country, right? When people don't know how to read and write and are, let's say, slaves of what the social media is saying, whatever that is, our democracy is at stake. So when we put that shared purpose over the table, you see people, organizations that are getting together that never got together before. So you see the power of people coming together as we never did before. So we love that. We love that, and I'm a big fan of that Focus to Flourish article as well, because I've seen it. I also have to say that what Alex was saying, recruiting and identifying those leaders is easier when Chile is a very long country. When you're far south or far north, it's so easy to do this, right? It's when you're in the capital, it's so difficult. It gets messy. People have different interests, right? But we're piloting, I would say, everything that's in the missing piece in the far south of Chile, and it works. It works easier. It's not easy. It works better, right? But why? Why? Because first of all, there are more relationships. Relationships are you meet people, you buy bread together, right? You meet at the store, you meet at the supermarket. it's another way of living. And in the capital, it's so busy, it's so quick. We're more individualistic, I would say. We lost the sense of community. And further north or further south, I would say I see a different I would say relationship. Then people are more diverse, are more mixed. You see leadership at all levels. And one of my most, I have to confess, one of my most favorite values of Teach for All is the globally informed, locally rooted. That combination is much, I would say, you see that more in the far south, far north of Chile. What are the strategic region and decisions we're making as a program? Very interesting. It's very, very similar to what Palau was saying in Nigeria. We are recruiting a diverse cohort, and diversity is very important in that way. And we have lots of things to increase and get better in that sense, but that's our objective. Second, it was almost, I promise I didn't talk about this with Palau, but we're doing the same thing, right? We're creating leadership at the personal level, at the, let's say, classroom, school level, and at the systemic level. We call it, as a matter of fact, we have the same names. I don't know if we had a coffee one day, Falawi, and we talked about it, but it turns out to be exactly the same. And the new thing we're doing is that we are, and I think that it's very important. We have to build the capacity to articulate and to serve in terms of this, let's say, objectives, right? Which is to recruit and identify, to develop, to connect, and to convene. I'm very pragmatic in that sense. Our budget is going that way. We're putting people, we're putting teams, we're creating capacity in order for this to happen. And that is something new and has changed. We saw it. We saw the network in the first years as an alumni network only, but now we see a territory network. We see that the network doesn't have to do necessarily with the program. It has to do more with a certain territory where these relationships take place, where you can put this common purpose together. So it's very invigorating. Henry said, which are the implications? But it's very reinvigorating because you see that people that weren't working together are working together. You see in a high, let's say, individualistic society as we have now, you see people coming together with a shared purpose. We see hope. We see a sense of urgency that I didn't see before. It's very sad that the achievement gap is not, let's say, in the front cover of the newspaper. So we see that sense of urgency right now. Like, guys, this is happening. This is real. This is urgent. This is an earthquake, right? But it's not a, let's say, one-time crisis. It's something that it needs to be a priority, at least for the next 10 years.
McKinsey just recently released a report on school system improvement titled Spark and Sustain. And we have invited one of the authors of the report, Stephen Hall, and his colleague, Diana Ellsworth, as respondents in our conversation today. Welcome, Stephen, and welcome, Diana. I would love to know this. What were the key findings in your latest report, Spark and Sustain? And could you share with us how these findings confirm or challenge what you've heard about the role of collective leadership in systemic change in education?
As Henry said, we just published a report which is looking at, actually starting from a very similar place to where Wendy started this call, which is, even if you look at the decade before COVID, most education systems are not getting better. And there's been so much effort and so much work devoted to reform and improvement And yet when you look at the results, whether it's on international assessments, PISA, TIMSS, on regional assessments like SACMEC, on national level assessments like NAEP in the US or ACER in India, you see that many systems are stagnating or even going backwards. And so we started our research from saying, let's actually look at those systems that have been able to not just create a change, that's the spark part of the title, but also to sustain that change, to actually have something which creates an impact for children over multiple generations. And what we found really was I think two things, right? The first is that the what you do is really important, right? So, and what you do depends so much on your context. It is no use if you are a system which is really struggling with some of the basics to look at what maybe it was Finland 20 years ago, now maybe it's Estonia. It just doesn't help, right? But then maybe as you're improving, maybe you start to do different things along the journey. But actually that's quite well known and quite well studied, whether that is RISE, whether that is other kinds, John Hattie, there's so much research on this topic. But the question is, how do you do it? And when we talk to system leaders, whether that is ministers and people in ministries or people in departments, people in districts, actually a very common set of themes came up, a common set of challenges, and so many of them resonate with what Palawi and Thomas were just saying about Nigeria and Chile. And so what we did was really to go deep in those systems that were able to sustain the change and look at the strategies they adopted in order to overcome some of those challenges. And I don't want to summarize the whole report because I want to talk about the fascinating study that we've been talking about today. But I think the first piece of that is, how do you build the coalition for change, which is durable? So whether that is teachers, parents, other parts of government, to make sure that the change you're trying to build can actually sustain beyond an individual leader. The average, this was a couple of years ago, but I remember at a conference, somebody saying the average tenure of an education minister was about 22 months. And you all know that changing an education system takes so much longer than that. And so you need to have that durable coalition, which is there. The second piece is that you've actually got the capacity in the system. You cannot do this top down. Some pieces of it have to happen top down, but you cannot do this top down in a way that actually affects every school in a state, in a country, in a district. And the third piece is that you've got to make sure you have the data, right? One of the pieces of the framework that Alex presented at the beginning was around feedback and the importance of being able to understand what's working and what's not working and where do we need to intervene and to change. And so, when we looked across the countries, actually the challenges and some of the strategies were somewhat common, but of course, the way it applies in different contexts looks very, very different. And so reading your report and hearing a bit from the colleagues today, I think the first thing is just how inspiring it is to see the global scale of the impact, just to see all the messages in the chat from such different contexts, and to read the case studies in the report, but yet to see the kind of common mindset and the common purpose, to use Thomas's word, kind of coming through in that process. And I think there were three big things that really aligned very much with some of the things that we saw in the report. Right? I think the first thing is, as I said, leaders change quite frequently. And so successful systems are able to build that coalition that can sustain, even if the political party changes, if there's an election or somebody changes the minister. And there were some great examples in the report of, I think it was from Austria, of how actually working with both sides, even in a very politicized environment, to say, actually, we don't necessarily care which party it is, we care about improving schools. And that's a role that you can play and that clearly your chapters are playing in across the world. I think the second thing is, we talked about, how do you actually build the system capacity? You need to have those leaders who are passionate and are empowered and have the skills and the knowledge and the network to achieve change at every level. And that's not just in the formal education system, but maybe that's also in other bits of government, or it's also in the private sector, or it's also in other kinds of civil society and nonprofits. And I think that, we saw so many interesting examples of places that have been able to do that. Even some case studies that also turned up in your report that I thought were really interesting. And then the third thing, and this was more, is you look across the report, that there are a common set of things, and I think that's a little bit, Alex, in your kind of way forward chapter, which can apply in every context. And yet how you do it looks so different, depending on where you are, depending on the resources that you have, both in your education system, but also depending where you are in your journey as a Teach for All, or member organization, in terms of that you have a little bit of a roadmap and a set of tools, and you can learn from one another in discussions like this in how this goes. Maybe then sort of three thoughts that I had that I would push on a little bit, that I was left with reading the report, thinking about what we what was in our report. I think the first is this is already a very difficult job, and often with new ideas, new initiatives, new approaches, teachers and different people in the system can feel overburdened. And so I think there's a piece here which is really important, which is how do we make sure that this idea of collective leadership is motivating and exciting, but is also framed in a way that people can contribute with the time that they have available in order to help drive change. And that applies doubly for your organizations, where many of your alumni may end up outside the system. And yet you want to find a way that they can continue to contribute with the time that they have and the networks and the resources that they have. I think the second thought was, it's there in the framework, right? But I think so much of the impact of what you do as an organization is actually on the technical side. The collective leadership component is really important, but actually how you train teachers, the materials that you develop, the thinking and the approaches that you can instill, not just into your core members, but also potentially more broadly in the system, is super important. And so there's a really important piece of making sure you don't lose that angle. And perhaps related to that, as you think about this collective coalition for change, that some of the things that you want to push for, maybe not everybody agrees. And so as you think about that collective leadership and that coalition that you're trying to build, there is a trade-off between the clarity of purpose of all of your chapters in terms of what you're trying to do and the challenge that you're trying to solve to close the achievement gap, to help children in underserved communities to achieve at the same level as everybody else. You don't necessarily want to engage everybody. So maintaining that clarity of purpose and that clarity of direction as you go about building these coalitions. Again, that will look different in every country, but I think that's a really important piece. But I think so much of this is very, very aligned with what we were looking at and the things that we heard and the things that we work with our clients on. So it was great to read the report and great to be with you all. Diana, I think you had some things you wanted to share as well.
I think as we heard the two case studies today, I think it just brought to life what some of those connections that Stephen was just making, that we saw when we read the report side by side. But then hearing it today, I think it is notable that, perhaps over a coffee at some point, you aligned on the way you're going to, build capabilities of your leader. But this idea of sort of leading self and then leading, teaching or learning and then leading systems, the fact that you're building this whole cohort of people who have those capabilities falls very much in line with, one of the things that we call out, which is this idea of cultivating leadership beyond a single leader. I mean, you are cultivating and find it as sort of core to collective leadership, cultivating this whole crew of leaders. And then I think it ties to what Stephen was saying too about, not underemphasizing the sort of technical solutions piece of it too, because part of what you're building and that capability is the leading of learning or the leading of teaching, and that you've got so much capability as well in helping build folks who really know, how to work with others, how to build that purpose, but also understand the heart of what the technical solutions will be to what you're trying to solve as well. So it was great to hear the case studies bring those points to life.
I'm seeing so many great questions and contributions in the chat box, and I would love to highlight this question from Simon from Oxford University Press, East Africa. Simon asks, very insightful. I am greatly excited by Teach for All programs and the focus on developing collective leadership to education. What mechanisms have you put in place to conduct impact assessment of these programs? Wendy, I think this would be a great question for you to address.
I think across our network, we look at 3 levels of impact. First of all, are these young leaders and teachers we're recruiting actually positively impacting their students' holistic development? That impact has to be there. Otherwise, those leaders may learn the wrong lessons, right? And also just for the sake of the kids we're working with. So we put a lot into that. But we also look at another layer, which is, are these new leaders becoming the leaders we need? Like, do they come to believe more in their students' potential, their own potential to make a difference? Do they come to understand the complexity and kind of adaptive systemic nature of the challenges? Do they become more committed to the work? Stephen mentioned that many of them will leave. That's true, but 75% plus of them end up staying in the system and continuing to work for the rest of their lives. And we want to see that. So we measure those leadership effects. But the ultimate question, which is, I think, probably behind your question, is how do we measure the long-term aggregate effects of this? And, I think to this point, we've experimented with different things. We've looked at case studies and kind of qualitative research, like over time in communities, do we see the long-term effects of this collective leadership development on system outcomes? There's an economist in the US who's currently looking at, whether matched pairs of communities, some that had Teach for America presence for many years versus those that didn't, can you see the difference in aggregate impacts over time? But the thing I'm really mulling on, thanks to this report and the evidence review that the researchers did about collective leadership development, is whether we can start, they have this framework saying, here are the outcomes of collective leadership development. Many leaders throughout an ecosystem with shared purpose, with relationships and trust, with mechanisms for constant learning and continuous improvement and reflection. And I think we've started asking ourselves, can we start measuring those outcomes? Maybe that's ultimately even more important than in any given year are we seeing an aggregate uptick in student outcomes, because if in fact that exists, we know that over time those communities will continuously, they'll be able to sustain the progress. They will continue, they'll make mistakes, but they'll correct them because they have the systems for learning and continuous improvement. So we're just about to start piloting and working to validate some measures that could actually look at whether collective leadership is developing.
I'd like to invite all the speakers just to offer a final thought in one sentence on the missing piece report and on how we develop collective leadership to transform educations. Please, one final thought, one sentence. And this is the model we'll take. We'll go Folawe first, Thomas, Wendy, and then Alex.
I really wanted to share a story quickly. And this story was sparked when Thomas was talking about the earthquake. And it's the story, I'm sure some of you have heard it, but it's the story of the hummingbird situated somewhere in East Africa, where this wildfire was burning this forest, and all the animals were just staring, in despair and fear, just looking at their habitat burn away. And this hummingbird was the only animal that was going back and forth to the stream to quench the fire. And when I think about the missing piece in this story of the burning fire, I think about the problem of education that we're trying to solve, where literally what should be happening is all these animals working together, for whether from top, bottom, from the floor of the forest to like the top, really just putting out the fire. And so when I think about what I've learned with collective leadership, it is really investing the time, the resources. I mean, the stream is a resource there, but then these animals were all staring. We're really investing in cultivating the agency, the leadership of all players that are needed to contribute to addressing this. That takes time, requires a lot of patience, requires relationship, but also requires intentionality. And that's what I wanted to share. Thank you very much, Henry.
I think having individual impact evaluation is one of the problems we have, right? We need to have shared outcomes to move the needle, let's say, in terms of territory. So one of the things that I'm worried about in the, let's say, NGO sector is that everyone has their own individual outcomes. We need shared outcomes in order to get together and, move a needle in terms of learning at the least. So just to put that as a reflection before we go.
I'm, first of all, just feeling so grateful for all the good work and such, and all the inspiration that's been shared in this forum. I think I'm mulling on one of Stephen's pushes in particular around this question of how do you draw the line between like bringing people in the tent who really are on the same mission, and not making it so diffuse that you can't make progress. And the one thing I'll say is, as I reflect on what I've seen, I mean, now across 35 years in communities in different countries in the world, I'm more and more lean towards the power of bringing together the folks with divergent thoughts. And like, if we can accomplish a shared purpose and everyone's there to ensure all kids are going to thrive, but they've got different theories of change, I mean, better to have those debates than to let everyone go shut down in their own silos, which is what I feel we see happening over and over and over in education. So, all to be further contemplated, and there's so much more to learn, but I want to see us experiment with how do we bring people together, pull people up from individual pursuits, and have those collective debates as a driver of the kind of progress that we need.
I think I'm just reflecting on this call as a further step in a long learning experience that we've all been having together around this topic of how change happens in education. I really like the pushes from Stephen and Diana on what we produced, the new stories that I'd heard from you guys on the call. And so I just wanted, my final thought was to a call to action of continuing to engage with us and others in the network as we all work out exactly how we get these questions right in our context to advance our shared effort towards this shared purpose of ensuring all kids fulfill their potential all around the world. And one step I'd love people to do in that is to download the report, read it. And if you have opportunities where you would like to engage other audiences in it or engage with us on it, please let us know. We love to be involved in the global learning side of this work. We think it makes our understanding of these things better. So don't be afraid to reach out as well once you've had a chance to have a look. I wanted to say just a huge thank you to everybody who participated in putting that report together, many of whom are on this call, and all of you guys for being here today. So thanks.
This has been a phenomenal conversation. Thanks to all our speakers and everyone else behind the scenes who made this possible. And of course, to you, our audience, for coming and for engaging. We've come to the end. Have a great day, everyone.